Cat, A Tale of Feminine Redemption by Marie-Louise von Franz. Chapter 3, The Journey to the Virgin Mary. To return to our story, at the beginning the Emperor and the Empress have no children, and the wife wants to roam about. The Emperor builds her a ship to do so, such a beautiful ship that there is nothing else on earth of the kind. One could rather look into the sun without being blinded than look at this ship. When it is finished, he says, "Tomorrow you can leave, but if you don't come back pregnant, you can't stay with me, and must never appear before me again." And with that ship she goes over the sea and comes to the palace of the Virgin Mary. First of all, the ship is a feminine vessel, universally referred to as a she. The ship is very often associated with the moon and moon goddesses, and also sometimes with the sun. For instance, in Egypt, as the barge that carries the sun across the sky. It facilitates communication, commerce, and cultural diffusion. Here again it seems to be feminine in that it makes connections and brings people together. The ship is a symbol based on the idea of a human construction, for it is a human invention to go where one normally cannot go by foot, to go over the water. That is the basic fact and miracle of the ship, so to speak, which is then associated with all these archetypal symbols, the feminine and the moon and fertility and the womb-like quality of the ship. So I think therefore that the meaning of this ship as an institution, for instance as the Buddhist law, the Dharma, are to represent the church or the Ark of Salvation, Noah's Ark, and so on, is the basic, most important meaning, because these also are human constructions, but they are not constructions in our modern technological sense of the word. All these archaic inventions of man, the carriage, the ship, implements for agriculture, the plow, all these first inventions always had miraculous meaning for man. Their inventors always felt they were based on revelation. They didn't feel as a modern inventor feels. I, with my clever wits, have invented a new machine. The ancient inventor always felt that a godhead had revealed or had provided something miraculous. Therefore, these first technical inventions, bridges, ships, carriages, always had a sacred meaning first. They were believed to have been given to man by the gods. A most beautiful story of invention is found among the Australian Aborigines, who tell how they found the bow and the arrow. They say the Rainbow Man, one of the original archetypal beings of the Dreamtime, came down to earth and his wife embraced him, hanging around his neck. That was the string, and the Rainbow Man, together with the embrace of the wife, were the bow and the string. By coming down showing themselves in that position, they enabled the Australians to invent the bow. The Rainbow Man and his wife disappeared into the earth, and from then on Australians used the bow and arrow. That is a beautiful illustration of how early man felt about an invention. It was always magic. The melting of iron, the making of swords, was also surrounded by enormous magic rituals, and was always looked on as a sacred divine thing, a miracle. So the ship has this quality of being a miraculous human invention, but one which stems from the gods and actually is a revelation of a form of a goddess, which man has then imitated with his mind. Therefore it still carries this numinous quality. The ship goes over the waters of the unconscious. We know that water generally is a symbol of the collective unconscious. Therefore the ship has always had the meaning of being something that keeps you afloat and makes it possible for you not to drown in the unconscious. Any philosophy, religious teaching, or cultural tradition is such a thing, like a ship that protects us. If we were to go into the unconscious unprepared, we would drown. Jungian psychology is another such ship. Jung made a ship by creating certain hypotheses, to which one can cling when one doesn't know up from down, when one is in danger of drowning in the unconscious, of having a huge inflation or something of that kind, falling into a possession, or being overwhelmed by an affect. Then such psychological concepts as Jung's can help. The analyst can tell you, for instance, now you've fallen into an inflation, or by using dream interpretation we try to keep ourselves and the patient afloat. All teachings and traditions have some value in preventing one from complete disorientation, which is a typical effect when one touches the unconscious. One becomes disoriented, and that's the drowning. Now, our empress first wanted to go with a carriage, which is a similar symbol. The carriage also has a feminine meaning. It is associated with the sun and the moon, and there are many traditions where the sun and the moon and the stars go in carriages or boats across the sky. In ancient Greece, you have the ship carriage, the Thespis carriage in which Dionysus revealed himself in Athens was a boat with wheels that was brought into the town. The interesting thing is that the empress wants to go over land with a carriage, but the emperor says no and has a special boat built for her. We said earlier that the empress was strangely restless. Generally, when a woman becomes pregnant, she wants to stay put, but instead of that, the empress wants to roam. We have said that she probably feels confined and has to search for something. One can say it's like an unconscious drive to go on a quest. Actually, she goes on the night sea journey, but she wants to go over land, and the emperor says no, she must go in a ship. What does that mean? If she goes over land, she remains on the field of consciousness, for land is generally what we can stand upon, known territory. So, if she wants to go around the park in a carriage, it means she wants to remain in the known territory of consciousness. But the emperor has better intuition. He knows that something more must happen, that something from the unconscious has to come in. This is a strange idea because it is much more dangerous to send his wife over the sea in a ship, but he wants the bigger risk. He even says that she must come back pregnant. We have spoken about that. Perhaps he wanted to get rid of her. At the very least, it shows an ambivalent attitude toward her. But he certainly has the right insight that stronger medicine is needed, a night sea journey, something of the unconscious. The sea is full of monsters and gods and leads to unknown mythic shores, unknown islands where gods or demons live. So he seems to have had a hunch. We need an excursion into that area of reality, into the numinous, the unknown, if we want to become fertile, to be renewed, because the child of the king always represents the possibility of renewal. Before we go further into the ship, I want to link it up with the next symbol, the palace of the Virgin Mary. At the time when the gospel history begins, she had her home in Galilee, in Nazareth. Of her parentage, nothing is recorded in any extant historical document of the first century. In early life, she became the wife of Joseph and the mother of Jesus Christ. That she later had other children is a natural inference from Matthew chapter 1, verse 25. The scriptures regarding her show that she followed our Lord. She was present at the crucifixion, where she was commended by Jesus to the care of the apostle John. Joseph having apparently died before this time. Mary is mentioned in Acts chapter 1, verse 14, as having been among those who continued in prayer with the apostles at Jerusalem during the interval between the Ascension and Pentecost. There is no allusion in the New Testament to the time or place of her death. The doctrine of Mary's perpetual virginity was, to say the least, of no importance in the eyes of the evangelists, and there is no evidence of its having been anywhere taught within the pale of the Catholic Church of the first 3 centuries. On the contrary, to Tertullian, the fact of Mary's marriage after the birth of Christ is a useful argument for the reality of the Incarnation against Gnostic notions, and Origen relies upon the references to the Lord's brethren as disproving asceticism with which he had to contend. The doctrine of perpetual virginity, though very ancient, is in reality of non-Catholic origin. The Proto-Evangelium Jacobi was written, it is generally admitted, within the 2nd century. According to this very early source, which seems to have formed the basis of the later Liber de Marie et Christi Salvatoris and Evangelium de Nativite Mariae, the name of Mary's father was Joachim. From her 3rd to her 12th year, Mary was in the temple as if she were a dove that dwelt there, and she received food from the hand of an angel. When she became of nubile age, the priests sought a guardian for her among the widowers of Israel, lest she should defile the sanctuary of the Lord, and Joseph, an elderly man with a family, was indicated for this charge by a miraculous token. Some time afterward the Annunciation took place. When the virgin's pregnancy was discovered, Joseph and she were brought before the high priest, and though asserting their innocence in all sincerity, were acquitted only after had been tried with the water of the ordeal of the Lord. The physical virginity of Mary became important to the leaders of the Church only in the 4th century, as for example to Ambrose, who sees in Ezekiel chapter 44 verses 1 through 3 a prophetic indication of so great a mystery. While much of the apocryphal literature of the early sects, in which she is repeatedly spoken of as undefiled before God, would seem to encourage such a doctrine of her absolute sinlessness, many passages from the acknowledged Church Fathers could be cited to show that it was originally quite unknown to Catholicism. In the 4th century, Mary's peculiar relation to the Godhead, which specially fits her for successful intercession on behalf of mankind, is met with frequently, for instance in Eusebius, Athenaeus, and Didymus. If its use was first recommended by a desire to bring into prominence the divinity of the incarnate Word, there can be no doubt that later the expression came to be valued as directly honorable to Mary herself. One can refer to the first sermon of Proclus, preached at Constantinople about the year 430, or to that of Cyril of Alexandria, delivered in the Church of the Virgin Mary at the opening of the Council of Ephesus in 431. In the former, the orator speaks of the Holy Virgin and Mother of God as the spotless treasure house of virginity, the spiritual paradise of the second Adam, the workshop in which two natures were welded together, the one bridge between God and men. In the latter, she is saluted as the Mother and Virgin, through whom the Trinity is glorified and worshipped, the cross of the Savior exalted and honored, through whom heaven triumphs. The angels are made glad, devils driven forth, the tempter overcome, and the fallen creature raised up even to heaven. After the decision of the Council of Ephesus, which declared her to be Theotokos, Mother of God, her cult spread like wildfire. Justinian in one of his laws bespeaks her advocacy for the empire, and he inscribes the high altar in the new church of St. Sophia with her name. Narses looks for her for directions in the field of battle. The Emperor Heraclius bears her image on his banner. John of Damascus speaks of her as a sovereign lady to whom all creation has been made subject by her Son. Peter Damian recognizes her as the most exalted of all creatures, and apostrophizes her as deified and endowed with all power in heaven and in earth, yet not forgetful of our race. In a word, popular devotion gradually developed the entire system of doctrine and practice. What you see here is a striking divergence from the Bible, where the Virgin Mary appears in only a very few places, to an enormous spiritual development later, slowly increasing in importance. First the declaration that she was Theotokos, Mother of God, then the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, and then the newest dogma of the Assumption. Though the Assumption has been generally believed since about the 12th century, it was only finally confirmed in 1950 by Pius XII. This is an amazing development if you think of the strictly patriarchal character of the original Christian teachings. After all, the dove of Mary is the bird of the goddess Venus. Of course, there were hesitations. There were sects that believed that Holy Ghost was feminine, and that therefore a natural family, father, mother, and son, resided in heaven. These beliefs were repressed very early, and church councils decided that the Holy Ghost should be considered masculine. And as Jung points out in his essay on the Trinity, the perspective values reflections over experience. It is not a natural family in heaven, father, mother, son, but an intellectual construction, father, son, and the mysterious force that unites them. So on one side we have a development which insisted on the masculine and the view of the Trinity as a masculine triad, and on the other side we see an increasing development of the cult of the Virgin. As you know, in many Latin countries, in the day-to-day life of the people, the Virgin Mary actually plays a much greater role than even the Godhead himself. The early Christians rarely invented new art motifs. As was usual in the art of antiquity, one always copied and recopied certain types. For instance, angels in pictorial or sculptural form were borrowed from the statues of Nike, goddess of victory. And on early Christian coffins, you sometimes find winged beings giving a crown to a human in the middle. That is the dead person receiving the crown of victory over death. but it is completely represented or copied from the schema of Nike, who crowned combatants in the Olympian Games, and so, in that way, all the different Christian themes have been translated, so to speak, from typical cliches of antiquity. Now the Virgin Mary's earliest found representation is simply a copy of Isis and her child Horus. The archaeologists had great trouble deciding if it was not just an Isis statue, and possibly it is, which was then used in a Christian church to represent the Virgin Mary. And so the Virgin Mary in art, and even deeper than only arts, really inherited all the main traits of the Egyptian goddess Isis, who in the late Roman Empire played an enormous role. The Isis mysteries were linked up with the Mithraic mysteries. There are many Mithraic sanctuaries that have both Mithraic image and imagery from the Isis mysteries. You find the same thing in Apuleius' Golden Ass, where Lucius is initiated into the Isis mysteries. They melt completely into one mystery initiation form. Isis was especially associated with boats and seafaring. In the Golden Ass, there is also this spring festival where one puts the boats into the sea again after having been on land over the winter. Isis is the protectress of seafarers and ships, was worshipped at this festival, at which Lucius was initiated after the great Isis procession. The Virgin Mary has inherited absolutely wholesale all of this symbolism. That's why in folklore, and also in the liturgy in some places, she is called Stella Maris, Star of the Sea, and there she too is the protectress of ships and sailors. When you think of the official image, you see that what is stressed about Mary is her spiritual aspect, the Immaculate Conception, the Assumption into heaven, into the heavenly Thalamos or bridal chamber. But Isis had a much richer theme. Isis was represented as the high divine spirituality, but she was also worshipped as the underworld goddess, ruler of the dead, of ghosts and the night, spooks and evil. Isis was a black goddess, not only black in the sense of evil, but also in the sense of nocturnal, earthy. Isis in the late Egyptian tradition was mixed up with both the lion goddess Sekhmet and the cat goddess Bestet. She was a mother goddess who comprised or contained in her image the highest spirituality. She is the mother of God, the new sun god Horus, and the wife of the reborn Osiris, and also the darker chthonic aspects of the Great Mother. She unified them all. She inherited or attracted to herself all the traits of many other Mediterranean mother goddesses. She melded them into one great late antique mother goddess. The Virgin Mary inherited those traits, but in the official teachings she inherited only the sublime and spiritual, the attributes of purity and so on. The other aspects of fertility and the dark side were never officially recognized. However, among the peasant population in agricultural countries, you see that all those traits that have not been recognized officially by church dogma are completely alive in the worship of the Virgin Mary. Many people are healed by a saint or by the Virgin. There's the habit of making little ex votos, a model of your broken leg or your broken arm or whatever, and you hang it up to give thanks for having been cured. There's even a Virgin Mary toad in Bavaria, where the toad was believed to represent the womb. The women who bore children couldn't very well hang up a womb. It was in too bad taste to hang up little wombs of wax. So they put little toads of wax around the statue of the Virgin Mary. But that simply meant thanksgiving for having had a child, especially the Black Madonnas, like the ones here in Einsiedeln or in Reidern in Uri, were believed to help in childbirth and to help sterile women have a child. It's still practiced today and believed to work. So the Virgin Mary in such local cults in peasant countries reacquired or kept, we don't know which, all the traits of the chthonic goddess, of fertility, of the earth goddess, of the dark goddess. And if you read the excuses for Black Madonnas, it's more amusing. In Eisendelnen, they say that once the monastery burnt down, and since then she has been black. But if you look at the statue, that is obviously not the case at all. There are no traces of burning. That story is just a cover-up of the fact that she is a Black Madonna and was so from the beginning. Most likely just inherited or replaced in ancient time an Isis statue, because generally, in places where there was a sanctuary of Isis, the early Christians then built a sanctuary of the Virgin Mary. And obviously in Einsiedeln it was thought to keep the continuity she was black and has remained black. Wherever the Roman Empire spread, there the Isis cult rooted. There you find black Madonnas. They occur more or less exactly in those areas. One doesn't make a case out of it. One just tolerates it, or invents a little story. She became black because the monastery burned down, or something like that. A way to make it harmless and tolerated. There are interesting parallels. For instance, in South America, where you have the Madonna of Guadalupe, who has very clearly inherited all the attributes of the Indian mother fertility goddesses. Wherever the cult of the Virgin Mary and the Catholic mission has spread, the Virgin Mary has always picked up, or taken on, the local characteristics of the great fertility goddesses. Therefore, on the level of folklore, she is not only immaculate and spiritualized and carried away to heaven, she is also the great mother of the earth, the protectress of nature. Then she has still another way of relating to the dark side, for she protects sinners. In many Catholic countries in Europe, you find a statue of the Virgin Mary where she holds out her cloak, and under it are a lot of little people, the sinners praying, and above is God the Father with an angry face and a bow and arrow aiming at them. That would mean that God would destroy them in his wrath, but Mary intercedes. She puts her cloak over them and says to him, "Come now, don't be so angry. They aren't so bad after all." She mediates. That's why she's the mediatrix, and why people pray for her intercession. She's believed to be more benevolent toward the shortcomings of mankind. This is typically feminine, just as in a family, very often the father thunders around and the mother intercedes. It's the same pattern. Now in our story, the Mother of God also has an ambiguous character, for she curses the future child of the queen. If you look for parallels, the only people who do that in other fairy tales are witches. If you look for a goddess cursing a female child, you will find only examples of witches or evil fairies. So here the Virgin Mary takes on the role of an evil fairy or witch. The official church image of the Virgin is incomplete, you see, and therefore the people provide the necessary compensation. This is one reason why it's so important to know folklore and fairy tale, because it is like knowing the compensating dream life of a civilization. In the study of any civilization, you can study their sacred books or their sacred teachings, which give you their conscious tradition, but you must always ask, and what is their folklore? Then you get the unconscious compensation for the collective tradition. I mean compensation not just in the sense of saying the contrary, for compensation is also very often complementation, filling in the gaps to bring up what is lacking in the official teaching, and in certain civilizations there is a tremendous gap between the official teaching and the folklore. For instance, in ancient Greece, there was the official teaching about the Olympic gods, which was far from what the peasantry believed. They had a more animistic, primitive nature cult, far distant from what you learn in school to be Greek religion, which was only the religion of the priest caste and the elite townspeople. You find this hierarchy in every civilization, an elite who carry a spiritual tradition, the teaching taught in schools and institutions in some traditional form, the conscious structure, so to speak, and then you have an undercurrent of unconscious complementary fantasies. We see them in the dreams of the people, but also when you study civilizations and ask what the simple person in the street believes and thinks and worships. The simple person in the street gives vent to fantasies uninhibitedly. You know all the Catholic teachings about sexuality, that you should have no sexual intercourse before marriage and so on. Well, I was once most amused by a very widespread little Bavarian song which goes, "I went to Mama and said, 'May I kiss the girl?' And Mama said, 'No, if you kiss the girl, that is a sin.' So I went to the priest and said, 'May I kiss the girl?' And the priest said, 'If you kiss the girl, you will end up in hell.' So I went to God himself and said, 'May I kiss the girl?' And God roared with laughter and said, 'Obviously, it's for boys that I made the girls.'" Full of impertinence, the young peasant boys sing these old songs. They are good Catholics and go to Mass every Sunday, but they sing the song and they practice what it says, not the other. There you can see compensatory correcting attitudes of simple people, which are also in fairy tales. In fairy tales, people let themselves tell stories about the Virgin Mary, which would shock the priest who took them seriously, and that is one of the great values of such stories. We can now interpret the ship a bit better because the ship was constructed by the emperor. That means he had an idea that the transcendental realm, beyond the waters of the unconscious, the unknown, should come in, that something supernatural or miraculous was needed to help this sterile situation. He had better intuition than his wife. He entrusted her to a structure, to a system, a feminine vessel that carried her on a night sea journey over the waters of the unconscious to the palace of the Virgin Mary. And now we come to some very strange geography. The Virgin Mary doesn't live as she ought to in heaven. Although she officially went to heaven only in 1950, she really was believed to live there since about the 11th or 12th century, and even before. But in our story, she doesn't live in heaven. She lives in a palace that stands on the water of the sea. She's not on land or on earth, and she's not where the Trinity is. So what does it mean that she lives in a palace? Aristocrats rule or live in such places. In fairy tale language, the king or queen, rulers or high aristocrats live in a palace, but not God. So here the palace again stresses a different quality. This is not the church's Virgin Mary. She would live in a chapel or in a church, but this one lives in a palace. One must put oneself in the situation of a simple Romanian peasant. For such a person, the emperors of Austria, the Habsburgs, lived in palaces, or in Italy, the Borromini lived in a palace. They are the highest, to whom one bows and thinks they are the great ones, those who have something to say and rule worldly affairs. I want to stress that it is not a church. So in our tale, the Virgin is taken out of her immediate religious context. She is more a ruler, a queen of an unknown realm. She's not the queen of the earth, and not, as she is officially, queen of heaven. She is a queen on the surface of the sea, which means in the unknown of the unconscious, a ruling principle that has no footing in human conscious reality, or in the area where these people projected their religious ideas. She is projected, so to speak, into an unknown third, and that seems to me interesting because it also shows that here the Virgin Mary, the archetype of the Virgin Mary, is still developing. You know, archetypes have histories over the centuries. Jung tried to write some of the archetypal history of Christianity in his essay on Job, and there you see that archetypes constellate themselves, develop, age, bring up their opposite. There is a whole play that goes on over hundreds and hundreds of years, and you can say there are certain archetypes that recede. They have played a great role, but then they fade. People lose interest in them. They are no longer constellated, no longer active in the collective unconscious. They become forgotten. And there are other archetypes that are coming, in the making, on the way up, so to speak, to realization. They cause excitement, new ideas. As long as popular fantasies simplify an archetypal image, then it is still in the making. A spontaneous process of amplification reveals new traits all the time, whereas if an archetype is fading or receding, then one only goes on teaching what one knows until now about it. It's no longer fertile. It doesn't inspire people to have new ideas. Now the fact that the Virgin Mary in our story is so out there in the collective unconscious, in a palace, and represented as a ruler, as something dominating that inspires respect and also uncanny feelings, means that this archetype is still on the rise, coming up over the horizon of the collective unconscious. For instance, it is interesting to note that after the Pope declared the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, there was a wave of Catholic priests wanting to marry, and women wanting to be allowed to be priestesses. The funny thing is, not one of these movements did they refer to the Declaration of the Assumption, though for a psychologist it is the obvious consequence. Why do the priests not say, since the Virgin Mary entered the bridal chamber, therefore there is a marriage in heaven? Well, you don't go into the bridal chamber and do nothing there. The priests want to marry. It is in accordance with the archetype. And the women say, now we want to be priestesses. We want to be admitted to the Holy of Holies. It's an obvious psychological connection and nobody mentions it. But there you see how an archetype is active, even if people don't know it. They don't know why they suddenly want to marry, or why they suddenly want to be priestesses. It is really the archetype of the feminine that is rising in the collective unconscious, still on the way up. And suddenly there are strange movements among people who don't realize what they're doing. If you watch from afar, you see they are in complete accord with what's happening in the collective unconscious. The feminist movements too. That all hangs together, although among each other they may have little in common. But again you see, if you study these deeper processes going on in the collective unconscious, you have in a nutshell what is essentially happening underneath, and then you are not caught in the surface waves of all these polemics, like should women be priestesses? Should priests marry? That's all surface waves from something happening deep down in the ocean of the collective unconscious. The important thing is that this feminine image wants to come up. And if you Look into fairy tales, you can read what is really behind it. So here we have the Virgin Mary in a palace, which shows that this fairy tale doesn't go further back than Christian times, probably not further than the Middle Ages, and that is picking up a process in the collective unconscious still valid today. The Empress comes to the palace, and someone tells her servants that the Mother of God lives there. The servants dare not go in, so the Empress goes herself and sees an apple tree with golden apples, and she absolutely has to have one. She says, "If I don't have one of these apples, I'll die." The servants try to steal one, but they can't. Then the Empress becomes seriously ill because she is now so passionate about getting one of those apples. The servants try harder and finally steal an apple and bring it to her. She eats it and vomits. Then she suddenly feels as if she were already 6 months pregnant. That's a unique motif. Normally in fairy tales, when you eat such a sacred apple, you get pregnant. But in our story, she doesn't get pregnant from the golden apple. She only discovers or realizes that she is pregnant and already for 6 months. So the child has most likely come from the emperor and is quite alright as far as being legitimate. But the empress had not realized it. She was pregnant and not pregnant. Only when she ate the apple and vomited did she realize it. So the greater part of the pregnancy was already over. But before we go into the strange and unique motif, I have never found a parallel for it. I want to discuss the apple tree. The most obvious association in our mythology is the tree of knowledge of good and evil in paradise, which wasn't specifically called an apple tree, but Christian mythology says it was. Eve stole an apple, and thereby brought to mankind the possibility of consciousness and the certainty of death. Life becomes real only when it is delineated by death. Another major apple tree is that of the golden apples of the Hesperides. These also have to be stolen. The Hesperides lie in the west where the sun sets, in the direction of death and entry into the unconscious. Those apples, unlike the fruits in paradise, are golden like the apple in our story. In some versions, the tree was given to Hera by Mother Earth as a wedding present. Getting the golden apples of the Hesperides was Heracles' 11th labor, and the only one in which he had to use his wits. He had to outwit Atlas in order to get the apples. This brings a sense of consciousness and knowledge through death and rebirth. In Norse mythology, Iduna has golden apples that rejuvenate the gods and thus confer eternal life. Avalon, which is also the island of apples, is where King Arthur goes at the end of his life, rather than the place where one comes from. And it was with the apple of this court that I first understood the value of conflict, the conflict of death as the bringing of consciousness. The goddess of discord and strife, Ares, was not invited to a marriage feast on Olympus, so she threw in a golden apple which said on it, "For the fairest." The final choice lay between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Zeus washed his hands of the whole matter and passed it on to Paris, Priam's son, who had been sent to take care of sheep, because Priam had been told he was going to cause trouble for Troy. Hera offered power, Athena military victory, and Aphrodite offered the most beautiful women in the world. He chose Aphrodite, who then helped him steal Menelaus' wife, Helen, and of course, the Trojan War ensued. In that story, different qualities of femininity become differentiated through the fight, and through the apple, consciousness becomes a little more clear. What I would like to pick up on first is this strange relationship of the apple to the land of death, because we had that already with the boat, with boat burials, but now it becomes clearer that the boat has a strong death quality in itself, and so does the apple. This is clearly a problem of fertility, of having a child, a woman wanting to have a child, and now death is lurking. When you analyze pregnant women, you find that many of them have death fantasies and a great fear of death. Naturally, you must not forget that until the beginning of the 19th century, a large percentage of women died in childbirth. And if you read biographies of men of the 16th century, 17th, and 18th century, they always have about 15 children and 3 wives because they had no contraceptive pill. The women had children all the time and often died in childbirth, or became worn out by constant childbearing. So giving birth and death were for them archetypal events and also quite concrete problems. I still notice that many modern women, especially with their first child, often develop quite a fear of death and fantasies of death. But that again is only the surface ripplings of something much deeper. Even if the birth goes perfectly, If there has been no danger and they come through it absolutely okay, still there are strange death motifs in their dreams. It is as if the virgin has to die, or the unmarried, the unbound woman has to die. A form of the woman has to die, and for a woman birth is also a rebirth of herself. She is different afterward. She is not the same woman. She's transformed. She goes through a death and rebirth process symbolically, and also the actual danger of death. Then there is this third motif, which is so mystical that you might laugh and think I am a mystic, but I have to mention it. Pregnant women very often dream that in the realm of the dead, things guard them. For instance, threads or materials are guarded and enter them and make the child. Now, if you want a rational, reductive interpretation, you can say, yes, obviously, that's the genetic substance from the dead ancestors, from the great-great-grandfather, and in the woman it is now weaving a child. That genetic substance, the DNA, is weaving a new child in her body from the bodies of millions of dead ancestors. Those cells have survived death. That's if you take it purely reductively, biologically. But there seems to me to be something psychologically equivalent. For Indian people who believe in reincarnation, it's very easy. Out of the land of the dead, out of the bardo where they have gone, they are reincarnated. I have not made up my mind about reincarnation, if it happens or not. I can only say that I have been amazed by such dreams of pregnant women, that a child is conceived or fabricated, motifs of weavings, of manufacturing something in the realm of the dead, the realm of the ancestors, and which is now, through the womb of this woman, going to enter life. It is as if the woman were instrumental in bringing something out of the land of the dead back into life, in a wider sense than just the biological explanation. For instance, the Eskimos, when a child is born, assemble the grandparents, if they are still alive, and watch to see who the child smiles at, and then they give the child the same name. And if the grandparents are dead, they give the child the name of one of the grandparents. If the child doesn't blossom and whines a lot, they say, that's wrong, and give it the name of another ancestor until they feel it fits. That's the one who is reborn in that child. Even if the other isn't dead, the child is the grandparent's continuation. So there too is this idea that from the past something flows into the child. The pregnant woman is the vessel for that mysterious process. She carries that mystery in her. Therefore, in her fantasies and also in certain moods or feelings, she comes very close to death. When I first analyzed pregnant women, I sometimes became quite frightened. I thought something would go wrong, some complication, but now I have noticed it so often and with absolutely healthy births, so I say, no, it's closest to death has some other meaning. It is the closest to the beyond, to that unknown source from which life comes and to which life returns after death, to put it poetically. The dual function of the apple, to create strife and conflict, is also in our story because the whole tragedy, the overall problem, is that the girl is turned into a cat and has to be redeemed. And this wouldn't have happened without the episode with the apple. So here, too, a catastrophe happened. But naturally, the closest parallel is the story of the Garden of Eden. God alone knows good and evil, but by eating the apple, you will be like God. You too will know good and evil. So there is the element of becoming conscious of the conflict, conscious of the opposites in the Godhead. We can only go deeper than that when we have discussed the cat, because we will see that the cat, I anticipate a bit here, is the dark side of the Mother of God. So just as Eve and Adam became aware that God has a light and dark side, that there is a conflict in the Godhead between good and evil, so here too this conflict between light and dark becomes apparent by the Empress eating the apple. The dark side of the Virgin Mary suddenly manifests, the dark side of the feminine, with all the conflict that results from that. So there is an immediate parallel between the two motifs. Jung has written about the philosophical tree of the alchemist, which bears silver and golden apples, and very often only golden apples. The making of gold in alchemy was sometimes represented as planting a tree and attending to it, which then slowly grows golden apples, and these golden apples are the equivalent of the philosopher's stone. So gold in that connection means immortality. Rejuvenation is another form of being immortal or keeping one's immortality, and so it is associated with eternity, the eternal, the incorruptible. In alchemy, gold mainly represents the incorruptible substance. It is a strange thing that by eating that incorruptible substance, death and conflict come into the world. Conflict, death, and the incorruptible are immediately connected. They belong together. That is the painful psychological truth we have to swallow. And that the tree in our story is a tree of knowledge, of becoming more conscious, is even expressed in words. Because now the Empress becomes conscious that she is pregnant. She has not become pregnant. She becomes conscious that she is pregnant. So the apple really has the function of conveying consciousness. There's another interesting motif. The strange craving of the Empress, who becomes quite ill and claims she can't go on living without one of those apples. This forces the servants to steal one for her. This is a parallel in a famous Grimm story called Rapunzel. A man and a woman live in a house behind which there is a garden belonging to a witch, and in it grows Rapunzel. That's a kind of lettuce, a plant with 4 stars, green leaves arranged in a quaternity. The pregnant woman says she must have some of that lettuce, and she's going to die if she can't have it. Now it is well known, and in actual fact, not mythological, that pregnant women sometimes have such funny desires. It is well known in popular tradition, too, that they develop a desire for something they have to eat in large quantities. It's probably physiologically conditioned. There really is something lacking that they instinctively look for, but it has also become a folklore tradition that pregnant women have such cravings, and by that they attract fate. In Rapunzel, for instance, the husband goes and steals the lettuce. Then the witch who owns the garden takes the child away when she is 12 years old and imprisons her in a tower. Later, a prince has to come to redeem her and deliver her out of the clutches of the witch. There is a close parallel in these two stories. Only in the Romanian story there is this strange twist that the Virgin Mary plays the role of the witch, but also fate is attracted by the Empress's greed. Here it attracts the curse of the Virgin Mary. If the Empress had become pregnant by eating the apple, there would be any number of folklore parallels. There are many where there is a king with an infertile queen, and there she has to eat something special. For instance, 2 flowers that grow under her bed of her wash water, or a frog tells her what to eat, and so on, and only then the queen becomes pregnant. So there is the motif of the supernatural fertilization of the woman, the supernatural birth which, with due respect, can be compared with the birth of Christ. The child is of divine origin, like most heroes in fairy tales. But our child is a very special child because she is not supernatural. She is clearly the child of human parents, the emperor and empress, and the supernatural element comes in only as an addition. She does not have, like Christ, a human mother and a divine father. Or like many fairy tale heroines and heroes who have a non-human parent, half human and half frog, or a tree, or a fruit, which means something non-human. She's essentially and normally human. The human aspect prevails, and the superhuman or divine aspect is only added to her personality. But she could never be seen, as Christ is in our tradition, as being truly God and truly man. She's really, truly human, but a human who has to carry a divine fate. The problem of a divine shape has been imposed upon her, and that makes her different from any other fairy tale heroine. She is essentially human, and that is different from the many male heroes in fairy tales, where generally the superhuman side and the superhuman birth are stressed. And such beings are much more ghost-like or archetypal. Our cat girl is not very ghost-like or archetypal. She is even a domesticated animal, and her behavior reflects this. In the total context of a story, if it tells about a human being, it means the problem is not very far from consciousness. If a hero or heroine is already human, it means that it is already close to consciousness. It is the same with dream motifs. If your shadow appears as a panther, then it means it's rather far from consciousness. But if your shadow appears as a Mr. So-and-so or a Mrs. So-and-so, then you can be pretty sure you ought to know what it is. When the shadow or animus appears in human form, then I usually insist, you ought to know that, or don't you know where that is in you? Because I think there the possibility is given. It's already in the realm of human realization. As long as it appears in other forms, it means it is far away and needs certain theoretical exercises, so to speak, to get at it, or to find where it is within oneself. Now if the patient says, your interpretation is very interesting, but it doesn't click with me, I don't see it. Then, if it is not a human motif, you must not insist. Wait till it comes closer. So in our story, it means that the problem is not very far from consciousness. It is something the Romanian people must have had a hunch about. We have dwelt mainly on the Empress transcending the taboo of the apple tree and how she, like Adam and Eve, committed the sin of becoming conscious. She takes a step toward becoming more conscious, and specifically more conscious of the feminine, in a feminine way, and of the feminine realm of life. So the first result is that the Empress becomes conscious that she has been pregnant for a while. If you study primitive societies, you see that having a child belongs to the religious mysteries of the tribe into which the girls are initiated. Generally, at the first menstruation, they go through certain initiation rites like the men, but they are mainly initiated into the mysteries of childbirth, which gives childbearing a religious frame. Childbirth is not something ordinary, biologically outside religion, as it is in Christianity. In Christianity, for instance, in the Catholic Church, sexuality is not banished or considered evil, but it is looked on as having to give nature its due. One has to give the body and the natural life its due. Therefore, sexuality should only be lived in an orderly way within a marital situation, if possible only for having a child, and having a child is wonderful and all right. And there is nothing sinful about it if it's within the institution, but it has no religious meaning. And the highest state of affairs is to become a nun and have no children. That is seen as a better kind of life. Because these experiences are banished from the religious realm, there are, for instance, no sacraments for the blessing of childbirth, no rituals to support a woman in childbirth. If she dies, she gets the last rites, but otherwise there is no ritual. That shows that it is not the affair of religion. It's considered to be profane, outside religion, that robs this part of feminine life of all its psychological depth and importance. It's seen as a banal, biological affair, and even enlightened women today still look at it that way. I have met women who were proud of the fact that they carried on their profession and had a child on the side, as they say, and without fuss, and even functioned. The child was born normally, but these women robbed themselves of a tremendous amount of deep realizations, religious, sacred, archetypal realizations. They never came up. The child remained a kind of desirable, banal addition to their life. I am sure that it is not good for a child to be born under such conditions. It is not received properly into the world. At least, if you analyze pregnant women, you see that their unconscious makes a big, archetypal, and I would call it numinous affair of having a child. And pregnant women, as I have told you, have this whole proximity to death, proximity to the archetypal world, mysterious dreams about the origin of man, and suggestions that ancestral spirits are being reincarnated. All these dreams show that there are mysteries, psychological mysteries, impossible archetypal inner realizations connected with childbirth, which many women miss out on in our culture. That is due to the patriarchal tradition and to the fact that the image of woman is robbed, so to speak, of her biological, natural under half. The Empress now becomes conscious, but that is impinging on the sacred realm of the Virgin Mary, and therefore the Mother of God is furious, and she curses the unborn child. If you look for parallels, I have not, in my knowledge of fairy tales, ever found a single one where the Virgin Mary curses a child. You have fairy tales where the Mother of God acts rather coolly, and so on, naturally compensatory to her holy merciful role according to the official teaching. But I have never found this one. You find the very frequent motif, the most famous being in Grimm's Rapunzel, where a pregnant mother was craving such as our Empress has and wants some special food, and then attracts the curse of a witch-like being. But here, suddenly, the Mother of God acts like a witch. It is as if her witch side comes to the foreground, and she delivers that curse. End of chapter 3.